This is a 1996 Mazda Miata M Edition that has a little bit of a problem that we're going to look into today. About a week or so ago, I was wheeling the vehicle into the garage and noticed a puddle forming underneath the vehicle. The puddle was obviously coolant, and my initial suspicion was that there was a leak in one of the coolant hoses. Did a little bit of a cursory inspection of the vehicle after it had a chance to cool down, looked for any holes in any of the hoses, didn't see anything obvious, didn't see any puddles on any of the internal surfaces either, or any spray patterns. So the next option was to go through and run the vehicle for a while and see if I could see any evidence of the leaks. And once the engine had a chance to warm up a little bit, I noticed that bubbles were beginning to form along the top edge of the radiator itself. These vehicles, as they get older, the plastic on the top and the bottom has a tendency to get a little on the brittle side. You'll notice some obvious discoloration, which we'll look into in a little bit. Instead of being black plastic, the plastic will turn a bit of a brown color. So what we're going to go through in this video is a replacement of the radiator. We're going to go ahead and take this opportunity to replace the coolant hoses, both the front end hoses, the bypass hoses, and the heater core hoses if we can get to them. Lastly, we're going to go through and replace the engine thermostat. Since we already have everything else pulled apart, might as well go ahead and take the time to replace that thermostat as well. So without much further ado, let's take a look and see what we got. So what has happened to this radiator over the years, and this is the original radiator for this car, is over repeated thermal cycles, the plastic is gradually discolored, and as a consequence of the discoloration, or as part of that, the plastic has become brittle. And when I was doing my investigation to try to figure out the source of the leak, I noticed that bubbles were forming along this area right here on the radiator. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see it on the camera, but there is a hairline crack right along this portion of the radiator. So what we're going to have to do is go through the process of draining the system out. That includes opening up the heater from inside the car that essentially allows us to drain fluid out of the heater core. We'll be opening up the radiator cap here on top. Since the engine's cool, we don't have to worry about the pressure in the system causing us any problems blowing coolant all over the place. And then we'll be loosening the screw at the bottom. I've got a little jug over across the room here that I'll use to drain the coolant. But let's go ahead and get the vehicle up so that I can get underneath it and open up that screw. All right, we're about ready to go ahead and drain the system of coolant. What I have is a distilled water bottle that's clean on the inside. I've got my funnel that I normally use to fill the motor with coolant sitting kind of plugged into a little hole that I cut in the top. I decided to go this route because I wanted to salvage the coolant. I do have a collection tub for coolant, but it's got dirt and a lot of other debris, and those were things I didn't want to put back into the motor when everything was all done. So this seemed to be the most effective way of salvaging everything. For those of you who are familiar with these cars, there is normally a plastic shroud that goes under the bottom to protect things like these air conditioning hoses and a lot of the other mechanicals that are underneath here. As I was doing my investigation, I pulled that off. If you're unfamiliar with how to remove that, there are a set of bolts, all 10 millimeter towards the front. There's another 2 coming from the side, another 2 up high. There are 3 across the front, and another 2 across the back here. So taking that off gave me a little bit more access to everything, and ultimately I needed to take it off in order to get this radiator out. So without much more ado, I'm going to go ahead and pop open the drain plug here, and hopefully everything will flow into my collection container. If not, I'm going to be dealing with a mess and having to clean that up. So let's see if I can do this gracefully. Let's see if I can get the screws started and not make a huge mess. Normally don't like coming at a weird angle on the screw, but and hopefully I will not be dropping this into my container. So let's go ahead and start the screwdriver. You see a little bit of coolant flowing out. Try not to block your view. And let's loosen it up the rest of the way. make a huge mess with that. But one of the things that I did to help kind of encourage the flow, I've already loosened the, whoa, a little heavy, loosened the cap at the top so that we wouldn't have to we'd have a little bit of a place where air could get into the system, and we'll let her drain until she's empty. Got a little bit of coolant on the garage floor here, but not a huge amount. Slide my bench over a little bit. Oh, let's not make a mess. There's the fun part of dealing with stuff like this, is trying to not cover yourself in the fluid. All right, at this point, we're ready to go ahead and remove hoses from the radiator. The first one we're going to go for, since we're already down here at the bottom, is this bottom outlet hose. There's an inlet hose at the top, and then there's another hose to the overflow bottle. All those have to come off before we can pull the radiator out of the system. So we'll try to get this guy loose. Hopefully without making too much of a mess. And this hose has been on here for a really long time, and I need to get this off the top here. There we go. I think we're gonna be able to move it off. There. A little bit tricky. Stuck on the hose. Always wonder if there's a tool that makes this job a little bit easier. Wiggle it down, get it kind of off the point where it's attached to the radiator. Should hopefully be far enough down. Now there's a chance that this hose has become thermally attached, and as a consequence, you may not want to let go easily. And the standard guidance for this is go ahead and just use a screwdriver to kind of break the seal loose a little bit. Apologize. There we go, we're getting it. A little bit of fluid will come out. The stuff that's been trapped here in the bottom. And oh, there we go. And that's that last little bit that was still there. I got a little catch pan here to keep it from coming off, but that's got that guy done. Make a little bit of a mess, but it's not going to get on the garage floor, thankfully. And then we will move on to the top hoses. Okay, at this point, with the back at the top of the motor, there are a couple things we need to deal with before we can actually disconnect the inlet hose to the radiator here, and this overflow to the hose to the overflow reservoir. And that is dealing with this rigid air hose that connects the MAF sensor to the throttle body. And the reason we need to get this out of the way is actually twofold. One, from the perspective of just pulling the radiator out, there appears to be a clearance issue related to the fan shrouds and this piece here. In addition, the thermostat housing is actually up underneath here as well. And so in order to do our thermostat replacement we talked about at the beginning of the video, this needs to come out. So there are a couple things we have to do in order to get this rigid air hose out. One is to loosen two 8mm bolts on either end. We need to get rid of this bypass hose here. And then there's a cam box vent hose that comes in here. All that needs to come off. There's also attachment points for the vacuum line that connects to the cruise control. That one's actually fairly easy to move, and actually loosened it before I started the video back up. But let's go ahead and get started first by loosening up this clamp here. Hopefully without damaging the hose. There's always a trick to try to get loose without doing anything. Grabbing, so that
looks like we're now clear that. And just release the clamp. And hopefully she will just slide right off. So that's good there. So we've got that guy removed. The next one is this line. And again, looks like it's going to be pretty easy to loosen that one up. Slides up and out of the way. And then lastly, we've got to deal with these clamps on either end here. So let's go ahead and loosen that up. Just get it loose with the fingers so you really can't see what I'm doing. I'm just using good old lefty loosey. So he's now loose. And then repeat with this end over here. Okay, that's now loose, but let's just make sure we've got enough clearance. A little bit more loosening here. All right, so that's should hopefully be loose enough. This one should hopefully be loose enough so we don't end up damaging this vacuum line. I'm going to go ahead and unhook it from here. So this is free all the way down its entire length. And we're now down to dealing with just this little air hose. And the other thing, I just want to make sure I've got going that there's nothing else that I'm attached to aside from this. And I think that's it. And that should hopefully be good enough. Now, this piece here and here is actually can be pretty tight. So hopefully it won't be too much of a battle to pull this free. There's actually a little bit of a ridge up underneath here that we've got to clear in order to get this off. And since this has been on here for so very long, it may not cooperate. So let's see. Hopefully I'll rip this thing apart because I really don't want to buy another rigid air hose. So I'm just going to carefully grab onto this and try to wiggle it loose. And it's not going to cooperate. I'm loose enough here. Believe it or not, this is actually sort of a rubberized material, but it's been on here for a very long time, and it seems to have kind of welded itself on. Yeah, I don't want to damage it. It's definitely glued itself on pretty tight. This is one piece I really don't want to have to replace. She's moving a little bit, but not as much as I would like. What's bad about using the screwdriver this way is you don't want to score up the metal. Any other damage. All right, so let's give it another go. And I think I may need to do a little bit from the other side. I'm trying not to just mess up the throttle body or any of the sensors that are up underneath here. There's actually another tool that I've got that I think I'm going to get. Let me put this, let me pause the video for a second. All right. One other little tool that I've got in my toolbox is a thing called a spudger. It's used for doing work with electronics, and it's made out of plastic, so it's less likely to do any damage to metal. And it has a pointed end and a flat end, kind of like a screwdriver would. I'm hopeful, in fact, that this thing is kind of a sacrificial piece of plastic. By using it, I can do what I need without causing any irreparable harm. Definitely flex the tubing a little bit, hopefully without damaging anything. And we'll keep working it. This is not causing me any resistance. Keep loosening the clamp. And it is not no visible signs of movement. It's not this far. A little bit more. probably see on the camera a little bit of movement here, but not as much as we require in order to get this thing off. Well, let's take a look at the other end of this. We have a similar issue at this end. And things are a little bit more serious on this side, given the fact that we're dealing with plastic. That's all metal, so it's less likely to crack. This one with the mass sensor, it's held on by 2 bolts on a plastic connector, so if I run into the same problems on this side, there's a good chance if I get too aggressive with it, I'm going to break something. My other option is to actually just disconnect the entire mass sensor itself, but let's give this a little bit of a go, and it's showing similar stubbornness. This one, at least I'm able to get this a little bit more up underneath there. I can break whatever attachment seal it's got. Might be able to get it. That's definitely helped. It's holding on the bottom. There we go. Just heard a pop. Oh, now this clamp is causing a little bit of issue. Back on that. And there we go. Looks really clean on that end. Let's repeat this process on the other side here. So again, just using the edge of the spudger, try to get it underneath that lip. Try to do it in a way where you can see it too. And this is something of a kind of a rubbery material. There's a sharp end here. Let's try not to poke that into my hand. There we go. This one, the seal seems to be a little tighter. Try not to damage the tube. Definitely inserted itself onto the metal. Still hasn't made that nice little click that the other one made when it released. A little bit of a tight space to work as well. Seems a little bit of interest in it moving, but still not all the way there yet. Given the fact that I've liberated enough of it, the other side gives me a little bit more leverage. She is stuck tight on that aluminum. It's one of those things when you finally get it to release, you give a little happy dance. Just get that clamp off ultimately. Well, I don't want to do too much of that. I'll put the clamp off here. At least it'll be clear when it finally does break loose. I don't know if I can lift and twist. That seems to give me a little bit. I can hear it clicking a little bit as it's breaking loose. There we go. It's got it. Make sure we got everything cleared. We're not grabbing on anything unintentionally. And there we go. All right. One rigid air hose removed. And now that gives us access to the thermostat. I'm going to plug this up with a paper towel just to keep dirt from getting in there. And we'll move on to the next step in a second. All right. That rigid air hose out of the way. We'll go ahead and do a little bit of preventative work here. I definitely don't like getting caught in situations where I have debris getting into the system from any odd sources. So what I ultimately end up doing is putting paper towels in various spots, and you'll see me do that on some of these cooling lines. I just kind of wind that down there. Also, hope I'm not loosening up a bunch of debris that's inside there. And looking up at the throttle body itself, it don't look too bad. A little bit of corrosion on there, maybe a little bit of seafoam might be in this vehicle's future. But for now, let's protect things with that. So now, with all that taken care of, we can go ahead and we're going to probably take this full length of hose out. Again, because of a fan clearance issue, I need to get all this space open so that I can work the rest of the way. I'm going to go ahead and pull this line out if I may, depending on how thoroughly it's attached. Now this one, I have a replacement for this hose. So if I damage it, it's not going to be the end of the world. Still seems to have a fair amount of flex on it. The other option would be to detach it from the other end. But if I really want to get wild and crazy, I can just go ahead and just cut it with a utility knife. In the spirit of being gentle. Broke it loose. There we go. So that's got that out of the way. Just going to hide that behind the headlight. So that's free. A couple of hose clamps I've got to loosen up. Channel locks just a tad. And wiggle it back and forth. Get it off into that radiator pipe. Get there. Should be clear on that end. And we'll go ahead. I think I'm going to hold off on doing this one until after I got that guy popped off. Just in case. It actually doesn't feel like it's going to be too bad to get off. Feel like there's a little bit of fluid in there. Shouldn't be too much. That's probably loose enough right now. Let's go ahead and get this other clamp. Over the years, these things kind of glue themselves onto the rubber. And let's got that off. that end. It actually wasn't as bad a job as I was fearing. And a little bit of coolant dripping out. I got a tray underneath. Oh, and there we go. And that's a byproduct of what you just saw just there is a byproduct of the fact that this thing's cold, the valve's shut, and there was coolant that was trapped inside there before we did anything. So because this was lower than this pipe, things didn't flow out when we drained it earlier. But that's not too bad. This hose off, everything out. So we've liberated all the hosing, and we can now go on to disconnecting the electrics. All right. Moving stuff out of the way, kind of tidying up the spot. I went ahead and put some tissue up inside there, though the valve's shut, so that really shouldn't be necessary, but also to kind of keep it from dripping any more coolant out. So on the radiator itself, of course, we have two fans. We got a large fan and a small fan. Each one has its own electrical connections, so we've got to get those off before we can unbolt anything, or it seems to be a good order of things. You may have a little bit of difficulty seeing this one, but there's a little tab. You'll have to lift up on it to get it to disconnect. So lift gently. Hard to get. There we go. So that one's all done. Got a little wet as we are doing our work. Not optimal placement for that piece. The contacts look like they're in pretty good shape, so I'm just going to put that right there. Then we have a different style connector at this end. I don't know why we got all these different connector styles, but we do. So this one is instead of a push up, it is a pull down. And it may require a screwdriver or some other blunt object in order to get it to release. What we ultimately have to do is get these tabs apart, but he's definitely locked in there. So you can see the tab. The spudger comes in handy again. One of the challenges with a car of this age is that the plastic can get a little bit on the brittle side. I ran into that with the MAF sensor a few years ago, and I was trying to loosen it and push down on the tab just broke right off. So push that in gently. See if she wiggles free. And it's quite unclear. I'm trying to make sure I'm doing the right tab too. That's definitely going to be it. There's not a tab at that end. There's sort of an interesting kind of hodgepodge of angles and wiggles on this thing. That end moves too, so we have a double latching mechanism on to keep it from breaking free at an unwanted time. The awkward aspect of this is it's a blind action. It definitely looks like it's the right thing to do though. I can just interconnect you. I'm not breaking any wires along the way. Alright, come on. Ooh. Take a pause. Edit this out later. Return. It's like one of those cooking show kind of things that go through and you know what, just start off, hey, let's disconnect this, and then a few seconds later say, oh, see, this disconnect, that was a piece of cake. It's probably beneficial for folks to understand that sometimes these things can be a little pain. Again, I don't want to break it. This one was easy, different style connector. This one, pain in the backside. The other possibilities is one of those things that requires 3 hands. 2 to operate on this, and then 1. Put down and lift at the same time, perhaps. It's like a little slot in it. Take the spudger up underneath there so it can slide apart. Sure enough, that was what required. So, 3-handed connector. All right, lovely. So anyway, so fence is connected. This guy is actually still attached to the radiator via a clip, which we have to loosen up, and that'll get this wiring harness free. So it is the one remaining little piece. I think hopefully I will not break the clip. Again, the age of these plastics is such that there's still a possibility that we might damage it and liberate it. There's a little tab, another tab here that we should be able to loosen and open if I can get it to go. There we go. So he just opens up kind of like a boat. Pull that wire out. And kind of rig it up behind this headlamp as best we can. And that's got that much. So what's next in all this? We've got a bunch of bolts we've got to loosen up. All right, before we can pull the radiator out, we have to release this bracket, which is holding in part of our AC system. So what we need to do is remove this, then we'll bring the car back down again, and we will then remove the 2 12mm bolts at the top. That should free this whole thing up. We should be able to lift everything up with the fans, and the whole radiator should be out. So starting off first, got my 10mm ratchet. Kind of squeeze that in there. Gently bring it out. There's a little squared nut on the back end that I want to not drop. And got my finger loose at this point. Yep, get there. And that's that. Square nut still up in there. Don't want to lose it. But I think I'll come and get that in a little bit. The main thing is now the AC bracket here is now free, and that gets us essentially done with this end. And with this design, unlike some of the other Miatas in later generations, this is pretty much a nice clear thing because I should be able to lift straight up without hitting anything. The bracket's right there, but it's designed for us to go up, not down. So that's got that covered. Go put my nut in a safe place, and we'll go back to the top. All right. Unfortunately, this next part I really can't show you very well because of how deeply they're embedded in here. The flip-up headlights are in the way, or the hood's in the way if I wanted to kind of reach down here. And I unfortunately don't have a camera rig that would allow me to put the camera on the firewall side of the engine. But what we have is we've got a 12mm bolt up next to radiator on this side, and we've got one more on this side. Now there's a nut that's actually welded into the radiator that essentially what it's anchoring to on the back side. So what we have to do is we've got to get down in there with as small a ratchet as we have, and preferably not tighten, and go ahead and loosen up these bolts very carefully. Hopefully they're not left-handed threads. I don't think they are, but they shouldn't be. There we go. Wasn't too tight. About 15 foot-pounds or so. Come on, babe. Stay. Yeah. And there's there's also a washer on this side that you definitely don't want to lose. Part of this process definitely feels like loose stuff now. Okay, that's bolt number one. Looks like it's in pretty good shape. And then this side's a little bit easier to get into, just for a lefty like me. There we go. Doesn't sound like it's loose enough. Got my fingers. Yeah. Not 100% cooperative, but there we go. All right, that's bolt number two. So at this point, the only thing that's holding this radiator in place is a couple of essentially grommet, essentially like a little rod that's hanging down in a cradle on either side of this. So assuming that's not all jammed in place or stuck, this vehicle's never been in an accident, so everything should be straight. I should be able to just lift this straight up and out. So if everything is the way it should be, and I've loosened everything below that needed to be, this should be hopefully a relatively straightforward endeavor. And I'm looking down there, I can see grommets down in there, the rod. I'll point them out to you when I pull this up. And that side, make sure everything's where it should be. That looks good. So let's see if it loosens up. Not. Nothing we've got involved in all this is AC cord. It definitely feels like something's holding it in place. Oh, geez. Still in there. Clip. There that I'm aware of. There's definitely much more to it. Yeah, it's definitely still in there. Go back to formula and see what's going on. All right. Figured out what my problem was. So on either side where those 12mm bolts went, there's an anti-vibration rubber pad. And what's happened over the years is that essentially, kind of like all the other plastic things that are on here, rubbery things, it glued itself down. So effectively, again, using just a flathead screwdriver, simple matter of just wedging between the bracket on the car and the bracket on the radiator, lift, and makes a nice little pop. And now we are liberated on that part. So the next part of this job should again just be a straight lift up, which is what I was trying to do a little while ago without much success. And again, just trying to fight friction. Friction is usually not a good thing to combat, but then again, you also don't want to try forcing anything in this little car. So I will now see if I can very gingerly lift this out. And we should be free. And that is that. So this is the radiator, the fans. We're going to very likely end up salvaging the fans. I don't think the new radiator comes with the fans, but now it's free. So we've got all this stuff out. Move this off to the side. Move on to the next step. All right, now with the radiator extracted, we've got a huge amount of space in which to work for. So the next step we have, a little bit of dirt. I'm going to try to clean that out a little bit. I'm trying to keep this area clear. But as part of the overall process, with everything out of the way, and actually before we put the new radiator in, we're going to do some of the other items that I had described actually at the beginning of the video, which includes replacing of all the hoses that are related to the cooling system, which includes this overflow, this line that connects us to the radiator and the overflow, We have obviously the tube that came in here that connected us to the thermostat housing. We're going to go ahead and replace our thermostat because, well, why not? The other thing we have in here, we've got a couple of other hoses that are part of the cooling system. So there's a bypass line that runs along here that we're going to try to get. There is this other line here, which if I can find the bottom of it, it's kind of snakes its way around down here. And from this angle, you really can't see it without me holding the camera by hand, though I probably could do that. Let me just go ahead and break this free for a moment. And I'll try to show you is we've got, oops, put my glasses on my face. So we've got, this is the bottom of the radiator. I've got it, more stuff is flowing from it. We've broken all these other seals. This is kind of an odd hose too, because what you have is you've got this short section. If I get down into the bay a little bit, you can get a better view. You've got, it's kind of hard to see, it's actually held in place with a zip tie from the factory, but it's actually a fairly short section of tubing that then connects to a piece of metal tubing right here. That in turn then attaches further up, actually underneath the heat shield, way back in there, if you can point to it. That connects to the back end of that tube way over there where my finger's pointing, and then actually out the engine down there. Now, two other hoses that have a nasty reputation of being difficult to repair from the cooling system are the infamous heater core lines. Now, this one is actually not considered to be too difficult to repair or replace. However, this guy is a nightmare because though it's easy to get to at this end, it actually has an interesting little kink and then kind of goes up between the engine and the firewall on the back side. And there's obviously a lot of material back over here. You got the booster for the brakes and obviously a whole bunch of other stuff back in there to make things challenging. So there is a chance that, well, at the very least to get this guy down here, I'm gonna have to go ahead and pull out the heat shield and take a look at what's underneath there, though we still have the exhaust headers to deal with. Oops, come into focus for me, camera. But then ultimately, we'll be in a fairly good position to get our new radiator in place and get this thing buttoned up. But for right now, I think I'm gonna take a little bit of a break.